Feeding our babies is supposed to come naturally. We see images of cooing babies and smiling moms and doting grandmas and expect that to be us. We don't see all the struggle that goes into every decision that seems so high stakes at the time. We don't expect all the leaking, the engorgement, the deciding to take a break. We don't expect all the judgment, whether we breastfeed or bottle feed or pump or don't. Or maybe we do expect all those things and it comes smooth sailing. But what I have encountered as a doula, a childbirth educator, and a lactation professional is that when I tell people what I do, the stories flow out naturally. And I love hearing them. I hope you do too. I'm your host, Lo. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. This week's podcast guest on episode 19, Vicky, discussed her difficulties with low milk supply. And so the following recording, you will hear me discussing the very basics of protecting your milk supply. There is more that goes into this, of course, and each person is an individual. And so if you have severe anxiety or even just a little bit of anxiety over your milk supply, I implore you to reach out to a professional. You can reach out to me at quabbinbirthservices.com. I'd be happy to help you with this. But this just goes over the basics so that you can be a support to somebody else if needed, or so that you can reassure yourself that you're on the right track. And I just wanted to point out that where I was recording, it was not my good mic was not being utilized, although I did not know it. So you hear the sound of my computer being picked up, but it was not worth re-recording. So I hope that you can still take the content and forgive the poor sound quality of this episode. So I thought that I would take a minute to ease your anxiety about low milk supply so that you can feel a little more prepared for helping other people with their questions about low milk supply if they're coming to you with questions, or so that you can feel prepared for your own breastfeeding situations. So, first of all, this is one of the most common worries when it comes to people who are breastfeeding. So, from the International Breastfeeding Journal, there is an idea of the perception of insufficient milk supply. That's an actual term, insufficient milk supply perception, and that's defined as the maternal belief that the mother's breast milk production is inadequate for her infant's needs. And some studies suggest that anywhere between 25% and 73% of mothers engage in early and unnecessary cessation of breastfeeding due to perceived low milk production. So the more that we can get the word out there about when a person truly does have low milk supply and when they don't, or the reasons why so many people might have low milk supply, not caused by a truly medical reason, but caused by practices that result in low milk supply, the more we can bring that number down and people can feel satisfied with their milk production and be cluing into their babies and what their babies are telling them about whether or not they're satisfied. So there are birthing practices such as inductions, early inductions, which then lead to complications, which then lead to milk not coming in that typical 3 to 5 day period that we expect, which then lead to early supplementation, which then leads to a cycle of supplementing instead of breastfeeding, which then leads to reduced milk supply. So there are practices like that which do cause low milk supply, but then that would be caused by a practice and not because the person could not produce milk if their birth had happened in a way that their body was meant to birth the baby. Use of meds can sometimes, in the birthing room, can sometimes interfere with milk supply, not always. So, I'm an advocate for for meds, but I'm also an advocate for people knowing the full extent of the effects of anything they're choosing in both birth and lactation. So, sometimes, especially when using meds, often you have to use IVs with fluids, and that can cause lots of swelling for both baby and mom, lots of skin edema, and then it makes it much harder for nursing. Baby can't get latched on, and then that can sometimes cause milk supply complications. Another birthing practice that can impact milk supply is separation of baby at birth. And this can be within the first multiple hours. So oftentimes when I'm having conversations with people about what they experienced in the birthing room, they'll say, oh yes, we had skin to skin immediately. It was so wonderful. It was the most amazing moment of my life. But then when we dig further, it turns out that yes, they got that baby immediately, but then maybe 20 minutes later, the baby was removed from the chest and was weighed and measured and cleaned. And what we know about how milk supply is initiated is really those first hours are really important of having skin to skin, snuggly time, uninterrupted, baby on the chest, rooting around, getting that opportunity to find the breast in the baby's own time. And that creates a hormonal response and will induce the milk supply. So if at all possible, preventing any separations during the first couple of hours, you can talk this over with your healthcare providers before the birth and write it into your birth plan to say, I don't want the baby weighed or measured for 2 hours after the birth. Even in a hospital setting, it is possible to advocate for that. Of course, if there are complications that require the baby to receive additional care, possibly from a NICU team or from a respiratory team, you can start over that 2-hour clock. So if baby gets whisked away for additional care, as soon as the birthing person and the baby can be together again, you can kind of try to recreate those post-birth moments, get skin to skin, all snuggly, blanket on top, and really get a good 2-hour time with baby on the chest. And then also stressful postpartum environments with too many interruptions can be problematic for getting milk supply going. So we know that often in hospital environments, you're constantly being interrupted to have your blood pressure checked, to check on the baby, to do a heel prick, to take temperatures. And those constant interruptions can interrupt the hormonal flow that's happening. So that is something to be aware of, that in those settings, that can be one reason why it's taking longer for the milk to come in. And then what happens is sometimes in those settings, things like early introduction of formula because they think your milk hasn't come in, or nursing staff not being educated about how tiny a baby's tummy is. And we know that a baby's tummy is about the size of a cherry, and that early colostrum and feeding around the clock is enough for the baby. We also know that sometimes sleepy babies who are really small need to be woken up more frequently so that they are not burning as many calories spread out. So it's really important that babies aren't fed on a schedule. And, we hear this 2 to 3 hour language sometimes. Nursing staff will say, feed the baby every 3 hours. Or sometimes we, as parents, have the idea that we would like to feed every 3 hours. But in reality, really, in order to get off to the best start with breastfeeding, we want to see feeding baby around clock at the earliest signs of hunger, and sometimes with some babies waking even more regularly than 3 hours so that they're not having to work so hard every 3 hours for those feeds. Other things that you can do to ensure that you get off to a good start with milk supply, in addition to these things that I've just mentioned about the schedule, is to
hand express. That's one of the biggest things that we know can impact milk supply. So always check with your healthcare provider to make sure that you're low risk for hand expression, but most people are. So in the last 4 weeks of pregnancy, you can begin hand expression, and you can collect the colostrum during hand expression and freeze it, and you can take it with you to the hospital so that if there is any concern about blood sugar or weight gain, you'll have that colostrum saved up from the first 4 weeks, and you won't need to offer formula. You can offer the colostrum from a spoon or from your finger or from a little syringe. You don't even have to introduce it from a bottle. And you can, we're talking about just millimeter amounts of colostrum that you can introduce in those early days. But hand expressing the colostrum in those last 4 weeks will actually get a head start on signaling your body to produce milk. And studies show that people who start hand expressing in the last 4 weeks and then add hand expression to their breastfeeding regimen once the baby is born, they typically do see an increased output in their milk supply. And that tends to be even more effective than adding a pumping regimen onto their breastfeeding regimen for some people. And it's a lot less time consuming because you can just do a little bit of hand expression on top of your breastfeeding instead of having to have a humongous pumping regimen on top. Something else to think about is just getting the oxytocin flowing as much as possible, so reducing stress within your home. So if that means protecting your home environment, not letting any visitors in that might add in extra stress, then do that. If that means sitting on the couch and binging Downton Abbey or Grey's Anatomy or whatever your favorite show is, The Office, then do that while you're breastfeeding, and just trying to have happy hormones flowing instead of stress hormones, because we know that welcoming a new baby into the home is stressful, but stress hormones and milk-making hormones, they're kind of opposing forces. So the more you can have those feel-good hormones flowing, the more successful you'll be with creating your milk supply.
I started the Milk Making Minutes because I'm passionate about supporting breastfeeding people. But more importantly, I knew that hearing real people tell real stories would benefit both the storytellers and the listeners. I had this idea for 3 years before I launched. I asked so many people how I should begin, and Anchor came up repeatedly as the easiest way to launch a podcast. And I have not been disappointed. If you are passionate about a topic and have wanted to start a podcast, you can use Anchor to record and distribute your podcast. It's easy to use. You can use the editing tools right from the platform. You can distribute your podcast episodes seamlessly to listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts right from Anchor. And the best part is, it's free. And the tech support has been great too. Go to anchor.fm or download the app right to your phone to get started on your great podcast idea.
And then lastly, I just wanted to mention some of the medical reasons we know of for low milk supply. This isn't well studied, so there might be more. On the episode that you heard this week with Vicky, the medical reason that she was diagnosed with was thyroid disease, Hashimoto's disease. And so the thyroid controls the hormone prolactin, which is one of the key players in milk production. So anytime you have a thyroid disease, then you could have some impact on milk supply. Another hormonal irregularities like polycystic ovary syndrome, also referred to as PCOS. Anyone diagnosed with that, they could struggle with milk supply. So we know that PCOS impacts infertility. So often people who struggle with infertility can have some struggles with milk supply. So be sure when you're seeing your lactation consultant that you bring that up, because it is a factor. It does not mean that you have to cease breastfeeding even if your milk supply is low. There are always situations in which there's a both and situation. You can always continue breastfeeding and supplement. And, every teaspoon of breast milk has 3 million germ-fighting antibodies. So every little amount that you give is so good for your baby. Any surgeries or trauma to the breast can impact milk supply. So an earlier guest, Melissa, she had a breast reduction surgery earlier in her life, and she ended up not producing a lot of milk and going fully on formula. And it was devastating for her. But in the end, she still would not have changed the decision to have the breast reduction surgery because of all of the ways that impacted her life positively. So again, just bring that up if you've ever had any surgeries on your breast, whether it's an augmentation or a reduction. Even if someone has told you it won't impact your breastfeeding, that's not always the case. So bring it up with your lactation consultant. Or car accidents. If you've been in a severe car accident and, the seatbelt pressed against your chest, something like that, any kind of trauma like that could have an impact. And then there is something called insufficient glandular tissue, which there are defining characteristics of the breast typically with that. They're typically kind of tubular shaped. People generally self-identify as having weird, in quotes, weird looking breasts. They typically consider their breasts being underdeveloped. They may have decided then to have a breast augmentation surgery as a result. And with this insufficient glandular tissue, we do see a coincidence with low milk supply. Not always, but there does tend to be low milk supply with that. It is not super common, but it does exist. Wider breasts as well, like 1.5 inches apart typically. So there you have it with low milk supply. I hope that's helpful. And, the aim of this podcast is to reduce your breastfeeding anxiety. And one way to reduce anxiety is to increase our knowledge about a topic. So the more we know, the more we're informed about breastfeeding and the science behind it and how it works. And the more we eliminate the myths, the better off we'll be. So I hope you share this podcast with somebody who needs to hear it, somebody who is struggling with low milk supply or who is currently pregnant and preparing to breastfeed. Please take a second. It takes just a second to go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and hit the 5 stars button. That's how more and more people can find the show. And the next episode coming out will be with another guest sharing their story.